Right. Yes, I can see a little ticker tape going now, so all the attendees are coming through. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Smedley, as many of you know, Acuity Associate. Welcome to the second of our autumn webinars that aim to pick up on white paper and the topical themes. In this case, we've got an update from the regulator with regards to the tenant satisfaction metrics that we're all expecting very shortly. And yeah, that update follows quite an extensive soft consultation over the summer and autumn. I'd also like to welcome Rob Dryborough, Assistant Director of Business Intelligence at the regulator. He's got the unenviable job of leading on this and value for money. So he's obviously done something really bad in a previous life to accumulate such bad karma. Before I hand over to Rob, just a few housekeeping issues. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. If you've got a tech issue during the session, use the chat function on the little taskbar at the bottom of your screens to get in touch with James. James, if you give him a wave, there's James. He will sort out all your wildest dreams on the tech front. Rob will be taking questions at the end. So he's got a bit of a presentation, so he'll get through that. We'll pick up questions at the end. Please use the Q&A function on your taskbar at the bottom to post your questions for Rob in a succinct and to the point manner as possible. I'll be serving as a bit of an active chair and putting those questions to Rob verbally. We are recording this and Rob's slides will be available along with the recording on our website afterwards for you to refer back to, or point your colleagues in the right direction if they can't make it today. Right, that's the boring stuff from me done with. Rob, without further ado.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just try and locate my slides. So there we go. Can everybody see a lovely purple slide saying tenant satisfaction measures? Excellent. Cheers. Thanks, Steve. Because as Steve said, I'm the Assistant Director of Business Intelligence at the Regulator of Social Housing, which means that my day job's to manage our data and analysis teams. And for the last year, a big focus of that has been developing the set of tenant satisfaction measures, the consumer KPIs, which were proposed by the Social Housing White Paper. That's part of a much wider programme of work to implement the consumer regulation proposals which were set out in that white paper a year ago. And we've just published a document called Reshaping Consumer Regulation last week, which sets out how we're going to go about implementing the wider set of consumer regulation changes. So I'll just say a little bit about that to start with, to set some of the context for where we're going to be going on the TSMs. And then I'll say a little bit more about the work that we've been doing to develop those in more detail and our forthcoming consultation. So just to start with a bit of a recap, a year ago, almost exactly, on the 17th of November last year, the government published the Social Housing White Paper, the Charter for Social Housing Residents, which, amongst other things, set out a series of propositions for the creation of a more expansive, proactive consumer regulation regime. And since then, we have been working to develop our approach to implementing that regime. It's been informed by a lot of stakeholder engagement over the past year, particularly with social housing tenants and landlords. And we've been focusing on 4 key areas. So the principles and outcomes that we're going to focus on as we develop our approach. The consumer standards themselves, we regulate through a set of regulatory standards, and we're going to need to review and revisit the consumer standards as part of the development of our future approach. We've done a lot of work and we'll continue to do a lot of work on our consumer regulation approach. So how we're going to operationalize this, to use a fairly jargony word, but what we're going to do to regulate this in practice. And then finally, the focus of the discussion today, the tenant satisfaction measures, so the set of consumer KPIs which were proposed by the white paper, and which will form part of our future approach to consumer regulation. The full panoply of measures in the white paper will require new legislation to implement. So there were various propositions, including, for example, the removal of the serious detriment test, that need primary legislation in order to be enacted. So we're waiting for the government to bring that legislation forward before we can fully implement the consumer regulation regime. But for the past year, we've been saying that landlords shouldn't wait for that legislation to get started on the implementation of the white paper. It's never too soon to focus on improving the services and the level of engagement with tenants. And we're taking the same approach ourselves. So the TSMs is one area of the white paper package that doesn't rely on the implementation of the legislation. So we've been cracking on that for the past year, and we'll be consulting on our proposals on that very soon in advance of the legislation to implement a lot of the rest of the package. In terms of our overall approach to consumer regulation, we will be following the same set of principles that we do in our current economic regulation role. These expectations were set out in the white paper. They work well in terms of our economic regulation, and we're going to continue to follow these as we develop our consumer regulation approach as well. So we'll continue to be co-regulatory, so there will be shared responsibility between the regulator and boards and councillors for ensuring that the standards are met. Will be assurance-based, so the expectation is that boards and councillors will have the assurance themselves that they're meeting the standards, and if necessary, we will follow it to test that assurance. Will be risk-based, as we currently are, so we'll focus on the areas where there are potentially the greatest risks and the greatest problems, and we'll be proportionate in our response. So our level of regulatory activity will be tailored to the circumstances that we face in particular cases. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to continue to be outcome focused. So we will be focused on the end results, where things are working or not working in practice, and not specifically on the process that's been followed to get to that point. So the destination is the most important thing rather than the route to getting there. We're proposing that consumer regulation should deliver the outcomes that you can set out on this slide. So these are based on our fundamental statutory objectives and also the expectations that were set out in the white paper a year ago. So there's the top 10 here in no particular order. There's an expectation that social housing should be well managed, that tenants' complaints should be dealt with efficiently and effectively, that tenants should be treated with fairness and respect and the diverse needs taken into account. The social housing stock should meet the Decent Homes Standard, both the existing DHS and in due course any adapted standard that emerges from the ongoing review of the standard that the government is undertaking. Landlords should make sure that the housing meets health and safety requirements and generally consider safety in the management of the housing. Landlords should comply with tenancy law and regulations and avoid unnecessary evictions. Tenants should have access to the information needed to hold their landlords to account. They should have opportunity to influence the decisions and priorities of the landlord. And landlords should take account of the views of tenants in the management of their homes. And then lastly, landlords be expected to work with other agencies, including the likes of council, the police, mental health services, and so on, to contribute to the safety and well-being of areas in which the homes are located, including tackling issues like antisocial behaviour. In order to try and deliver those outcomes, we're going to be reviewing our consumer standards. We currently have a suite of 4 of those, and we're going to look to build on what those existing standards say, take the bits that currently work well and build out and expand on those to focus on particularly the 6 themes that you can see set out on this slide. So the safety of the home, the quality of the home, the neighbourhood, the transparency of the landlord in terms of making information accessible to their tenants, engagement and accountability and the kind of the quality of the information sharing and responsiveness of the landlord to their tenants. And finally, tenancy requirements around nominations, allocations, mutual exchange, and so on. We will, in due course, be doing a further statutory consultation on proposals to refine and replace our existing consumer standards, but that's a little bit further down the track, and we'll be doing a lot of engagement with stakeholders, both tenants and landlords, between now and then, in order to help us shape the propositions that we'll eventually be consulting on. The area we're going to focus on today is the tenant satisfaction measures, which were proposed by the white paper. These were one of the core elements of the consumer regulation proposals that the white paper set out. And the intention was there would effectively be a set of consumer KPIs with two main purposes. Firstly, they're intended to provide a source of information for tenants, so to support the tenant transparency agenda, to provide clear, comparable information that will help tenants hold their own landlords to account. And secondly, they're intended to act as a source of regulatory intelligence for us, to provide us with information that we can then use as part of our future proactive consumer regulation approach to identify whether or not landlords are meeting those future consumer standards. They won't be the be-all and end-all of our future approach. They'll just be one source of information amongst several that we'll use to try and gather assurance on whether or not landlords are meeting those standards. So we won't be reaching a view in isolation based on what these numbers will show on whether landlord X or landlord Y is or isn't meeting the consumer standards. We take the information, triangulate it against other sources of information that we get in, so potentially referrals from the ombudsman, self-referrals from the landlord, whistleblowing, other sources of regulatory data, information that we would get out of our engagement with the landlord. So we take all of that together in order to try and reach a kind of a rounded view on the landlord's performance. So the TSMs, although they're the first thing that we're going to be consulting on, won't be the only element of our future regulatory approach. They'll be part of it. However, as the white paper said, they are going to be a considerable focus of the development of that consumer regulation approach. And there were a number of expectations that the white paper set. Firstly, we should develop a set of TSMs on things that matter to tenants. And secondly, there was an expectation that the set of metrics that we produce should cover the themes and issues which are set out on the slide that you can see in front of us. So there were 5 main themes that we're expected to cover in developing the TSMs: keeping properties in good repair, maintaining building safety, the effective handling of complaints, respectful and helpful engagement, and responsible neighbourhood management, including a particular focus on antisocial behaviour. And the white paper tasked us with going away and working up the detail on these. So although it set out at a high level the issues that the government was interested in seeing explored through this, they were deliberately, consciously set at quite a high level. So there's a lot of devil in the detail in this area, and basically we were tasked with going away and exploring that detail. So what you can see in front of you covers the issues that the government's interested in, but it doesn't include all that nitty-gritty that you need to actually translate these into a set of working KPIs. So the detail of what questions are asked, who's asked the questions, what type of properties are involved, what's the response scale, what kind of methodology do you need to follow in order to ask the questions. So we've been doing a lot of work over the past year to try and get to the bottom of those detailed questions and translate these kind of high-level proposals from the white paper into a set of detailed propositions for consultation and subsequently implementation. To help us do that, we developed a set of principles to help guide us through the maze of developing that detail. We've got a set of 3 tests that we're applying to the development of all of our new consumer regulation proposals, which are, will it make a difference to tenants? Is it something that landlords can actually deliver? And is it something that we can actually regulate? And we've been applying those 3 general tests to everything that we're thinking about in this area, including the development of the TSMs. But we've also set a slightly more detailed, specific set of principles to help guide us on the development of the TSMs in particular, which you can see set out here. So the first of those is that all of the data that we collect needs to be relevant to our regulatory remit. The information's got to be traceable back to our statutory objectives. We can't collect information, no matter how useful or interesting, that doesn't relate to the job that we've been given by Parliament. In practical terms, that's not been too much of an issue so far, because the set of measures that were set out in the white paper can fairly clearly be traced back to our statutory objectives on our existing set of consumer standards. So that's not been one we've had to worry about too much. Secondly, we want to make sure that all of the measures are relevant. And what we mean by that is relevant to the 2 aims of the white paper. We want all of them to either be useful to tenants as a source of information about the landlord, or useful to us as a regulator as a source of regulatory intelligence. Ideally, they would work for both purposes. In practice, some of them might be better for one purpose than the other, but we want all of the metrics we introduce to tick at least one of those boxes, and ideally both. Obviously, we want the data that comes out at the end of this process to be accurate. And there's a number of things that we're going to need to achieve in order to make sure that that's the case. We'll need to make sure that all of the metrics and the questions that sit underneath them are clearly and well defined. We can't have any scope for significant differences in interpretation, 2 people looking at exactly the same question and reaching different views about what it's going to mean, because if that happens, we won't be able to get comparable data. We want to make sure that the data that comes back can be meaningfully compared across the sector, so it tells you something useful and allows different landlords of different types to be compared. A lot of this is going to rely on surveying tenants, so we need to make sure that the survey methodology that sits underneath that is consistent and robust, so that we try and minimize the risk that any differences in the results that come out are purely the result of differences in the way that people have conducted their surveys. We need the interpretation of the results to be objective as far as possible. We don't want things where people can look at the same number and think, what does that mean? Is that number good, bad, or indifferent? We want something that is clear and objective as far as possible. A big issue that's come out of a lot of our stakeholder engagement, and particularly some of our discussions with tenants, is the need to try and minimize the scope for gaming. So effectively minimizing the risk that people just focus on what the number says, and try and focus on making the score on the door look as good as possible without doing anything to improve the underlying reality of what's going on the ground. And finally, we want to make sure that the results are verifiable. So if either we as regulator or anybody else needs to be able to go back and look at how the numbers were calculated, to try and identify whether there's any kind of problems in there, we need to make sure that there's kind of an audit trail that can be followed back that allows us to go and test where the numbers have come from. We want the results to be responsive, and what we mean by that is responsive to the actions of the landlord. So ultimately, we need information that is useful to us in our regulatory purposes, and we regulate social landlords, so we need something that tells us about the performance of the landlord, and ideally about the desirable performance of the landlord. So we want to try and avoid perverse incentives. I think most people can think of examples from other performance management regimes where a target has been set that's kind of created perverse consequences. So waiting time, saying you need an appointment within 48 hours, which means that you can't get one in 72 hours, even if that's what you want. We want to try and avoid that kind of thing as far as possible. We want to try and avoid creating any really obvious gaps in the suite, so people ignore important issues just because it's not being measured. We want to make sure that the the metrics are attributable to the regulated organisation as far as we can. That's particularly knotty in a couple of cases, particularly around the contribution to neighbourhoods, the contribution to tackling antisocial behaviour, where there are likely to be multiple agencies involved. So in terms of the quality of a neighbourhood, there's probably multiple social landlords, maybe private landlords. There may be the council with its role as a landlord and the council in its more general role. The police may have a role. So there'll be all sorts of actors contributing to the overall quality of the neighbourhood. It's quite difficult to tease out, but as far as possible, we want to try and draw out the information that is relevant to the organisations that we regulate. And finally, under that header, we want the information to be reasonably timely. So we want data that tells us something about how the landlord is doing now, not how it was doing back at the year dot. And then finally, we want the whole package to be deliverable. Firstly, we want it to be cost effective. It's not going to be cost-free. It's going to involve the regulator doing more work. It's likely to involve landlords doing things differently how they do it at the moment, so there will be some costs. But ultimately, all of that money is either going to come out of tenants' rents or it's going to come from the taxpayer. So as far as possible, we want to make sure that we do this in the most cost-effective way that we can. And finally, we want the data collection process to be as straightforward as possible, partly because if we come up with something very complex, it creates greater room for error, but also we just want to kind of go with the grain of systems as they are at the moment for ease of implementation for all concerned. So we are about to launch a consultation on the fruits of our labours on that over the last year or so. And the foundation of that consultation will be a proposed new consumer standard on the TSMs. As of today, it's not a regulatory requirement that anybody needs to do this. So there's nothing in our regulatory standards right now that says landlords have got to collect this information, they've got to submit it in this way, they've got to report it in this way. So we need to introduce that regulatory requirement. As I said a minute ago, we're going to be reviewing all of our consumer standards in due course, but that's coming a bit further down the track. So for the time being, we're proposing making a fairly self-contained change to our standards, which will just introduce the requirements on the TSMs and not do anything else. That may end up being an interim position. We may end up locating these requirements somewhere else in the wider regulatory suite when we've done that full review of the consumer standards. But for the time being, we're proposing doing something fairly short and sweet, self-contained, that just sets out what landlords need to do on the TSMs. And that will address some of the kind of key areas around the data collection requirements, publication requirements, submission requirements to the regulator, and some of the general issues that we're always interested in around data quality. However, whilst that's important, and it forms the foundation of the consultation that we're putting out, in some ways, it's the least complicated part of it. And a lot of the kind of the technical work and ultimately what will be kind of greatest interest we expect is the work on refining and defining the TSMs themselves. And we've been doing a lot of work on this over the last year. We've done a lot of analysis to establish an evidence base. So we've looked at a lot of the work that's already in use in the sector, the approaches that a lot of landlords are taking right now. So we've looked at things like the approach that Housemarque take, the STAR survey, what our counterparts in Scotland currently do in this space. We've looked at what a lot of our predecessor regulators, the Housing Corporation, the TSA, have done in the past in England, to try and tease out what works well, what doesn't work well. And we've also spread the net a bit more widely and looked at the existing requirements in related areas. So in particular, issues like the health and safety legislation, the Housing Ombudsman's requirements in terms of the complaints handling code, to make sure that what we come up with on the TSMs is consistent with existing requirements and doesn't either duplicate or introduce confusion. We've done a lot of work to try and define our terms, to try and make sure that there aren't any inconsistencies in there, and any differences in meaning are minimised and ironed out as far as possible in order to make sure that it's clear what we're talking about and the results end up being comparable. We've done a lot of work looking at our existing regulatory evidence, including what we already get in through some of our other data returns. We don't want to end up with two versions of the truth or unnecessary duplication in areas where we already collect some information. For example, the decent homes data that we get in through the SDR. A lot of our thinking has been about a fairly complex trade-off between, on the one hand, making sure that we come up with a set of requirements that is tight enough and prescriptive enough that the results will be comparable, making sure that everybody is abiding by, broadly speaking, the same set of rules on the one hand. But on the other hand, going back to those regulatory principles I set out at the outside, something that's still consistent with our general approach to co-regulation, the need to minimise interference and generally give landlords enough flexibility to try and create something that works for them as an organisation and reflects their unique circumstances. There's probably no right place to land on that spectrum. And it's a question of judgment, a question of perspective, but it's a trade-off and an issue that's informed a lot of our thinking. I'll come to some illustrations, some of the cases where this is likely to be an issue that we'll explore through the consultation in a couple of slides' time. And we've done a lot of work testing our emerging proposals with stakeholders from across the sector. I think at the last count, we've spoken to 70 to 80 different organisations and representative groups. So we haven't spoken to the whole sector by any means, but we've done quite a lot of engagement to test out our initial proposals and try and smooth some of the rough edges off. We've set up a sounding board, which has been meeting regularly, which includes a lot of the key representative organisations, landlords, large and small, from both the PRP and the local authority sector, tenant representative organisations from TPAS and Taro, and we've been testing out quite a few of our emerging propositions with that group. We've also held a series of tenant workshops over the summer, and we've been having an awful lot of small group and bilateral conversations with people with particular expertise in this area. So that includes some of our counterparts in the public sector, so the Housing Ombudsman on complaints, the Health and Safety Executive and the Building Safety Regulator on some of the health and safety issues, groups like Housemark and Acuity who are hosting us today, and a lot of other kind of people with technical expertise in issues like health and safety. So we've done a lot of work so far, and we've had a lot of feedback on the general idea and some of our emerging propositions. I would say in general, stakeholders we spoke to welcomed our approach to engagement. People seem to have appreciated the fact that we've done a lot of work in advance of moving to the formal consultation stage, that we've been testing out some of the ideas and rubbed off some of the rough edges, tried to identify some of the obvious risky areas and potential clangers up front. And I think there's generally acceptance of the idea that introducing a set of TSMs is a useful exercise and the recognition that this is coming down the track. That said, we've had a lot of detailed feedback on some of our proposals. Some of it supportive, some of it less so, and that's helped us shape the more detailed proposals that we're going to be consulting on shortly. It's helped us identify some of the areas that are potentially problematic, some of the areas that are likely to prove contentious, and some of the areas that we're going to need to explicitly ask people about in the consultation itself. It's become clear that there are some aspects of the proposals that are likely to divide opinion. And in a lot of cases, there is genuinely no right answer. Some of them are questions of judgment, and there are, firmly held and kind of cogently argued alternative camps on some of these issues. And I would expect that we'll get a lot of feedback with reflecting those different positions when we move to the formal consultation stage. And finally, kind of a common theme that's come out was concern from both landlords and particularly tenants about the potential for gaming any system of performance measurement, but for the need for us to go as far as we possibly can in trying to mitigate that risk in our propositions. In terms of detailed feedback, I think that falls into two main camps. So firstly, on this slide, you can see some of the main issues that have come up in a methodological sense. So particularly around the question of how we should set the rules in terms of the conducting of tenant surveys. We've had a lot of discussions with stakeholders about the appropriate frequency of surveys. There's a wide range of existing practice in the sector at the moment. So some organisations are already surveying their tenants very frequently on a quarterly basis or even on a continuous rolling basis. Others do it annually. Others only do a set piece survey maybe once every 2 years. And this varies according to different types of providers, different sizes of providers. So one of the issues that we're going to need to draw out in the consultation is what is the most appropriate frequency for submitting this information, and in particular, what's the most appropriate frequency to be surveying your tenants. We've had a lot of discussions about the appropriate types of social housing to include within the scope of the exercise, and particularly about how to approach particular different types of social housing. So, for example, the differences between social rented stock and shared ownership stock, where there are known differences in reported satisfaction between those different groups, and where the landlord's responsibility differs between those different groups. So clearly there are differing responsibilities in terms of the compliance with the Decent Homes Standard between those different groups. Landlords have got different responsibilities in terms of a repairs service for those different groups. How should we reflect that in our requirements? A lot of discussions with different landlords about the expectations on different types of landlords. So should the expectations differ in any way between housing associations and local authorities? Should there be any differing proportionate expectations for landlords of different sizes, levels of staffing and so on, taking into account a range of different issues in terms of capacity, skills, regulatory burden, privacy issues for smaller organisations, statistical issues around the statistical accuracy and how easy it is to get those with organisations of different sizes. So a range of different issues relevant to different types of landlord, particularly around the question of size. I think we've had general recognition that in terms of surveying tenants, this is going to need to be a sample-based exercise, particularly for some of the very biggest organisations with 50,000 or 100,000 or more tenants. It's probably not going to be practical to survey every single one of your tenants every single year. So it will need to be based on a sample in some way. And also, I'd say we've got general recognition of the fact that that sample will need to be representative of the population of that landlord. We know that there are very different reported satisfaction levels on average for different types of housing. So there are differences between supported housing and general needs housing and shared ownership housing. There are differences in between satisfaction in different parts of the country on the basis of ethnicity and age and so on. So who you sample can make a very big difference to the results that come out at the end of it. So we're going to need to think quite clearly and carefully about how we set the expectations on how you define a representative sample. And finally, and this has been one of the areas where I think it's been clear that there are different schools of thought, there's a lot of discussions around collection methods. So at the moment, there are a wide range of different approaches that people take to surveying their tenants, face-to-face interviews, phone interviews, online, paper surveys. They've all got their role, they've all got their advantages and disadvantages, but they can produce very different results in terms of the reported level of satisfaction, all things being equal. So we've had one school of thought which suggests we need to be very prescriptive about what requirements we set. We say this is exactly how you should be undertaking your surveys, because if you don't do that, the results will be driven by the survey methodology as well as the underlying performance of the landlord. On the other hand, we've had a lot of people say to us, but hang on, we want to reach as many tenants as possible. The best way of doing that is to allow a wide range of different methodologies. Some approaches are more accessible for different groups of tenants than others. If you want us to reach a representative group of our tenants, make it as easy as people to access this as possible, you need to allow a range of methods. So we've had some, very clear, well-evidenced argument both ways, and we're going to need to think quite carefully about how we try and balance that in the proposals that we consult on. We've also had a lot of discussions around the detail of individual measures and issues in there. I think that overall we've identified about 150 different points on which we're going to need to make a decision one way or the other. But there have been some issues that keep coming up more often than others, and you can see a few of those on this slide here. So one of the main areas proposed in the white paper was around repairs, and particularly responsive repairs. That's quite a complicated area to measure. In particular, we've had a lot of discussions about whether right first time is the best way of capturing that as an issue, because it's a complex concept. A lot of people in the sector take different approaches to measuring that at the moment. Where should we land on this? How should we define responsive repairs in our set of metrics? We've had a lot of feedback on complaints, partly the balance between complaints measures and the rest of the proposals in the suite, but also a series of more detailed comments, or some of them kind of technical, around how to go about making sure there's a sufficiently large sample size for some of the more precise, granular complaints measures that were proposed in the white paper. We've also had some feedback, particularly from tenants, about the perceived gatekeeper role of the landlord and the different ways in which different landlords go about categorising and reporting complaints. And in particular, some feedback from tenants on whether or not complaints to the landlord is the best way of capturing concern about whether tenants have been treated fairly and with respect, or whether that should be done through surveying tenants directly. So we're going to give some fairly careful thought to the relationship between the complaints measures in the suite and the tenant survey measures, where we'll go out and ask people to survey their tenants directly rather than capturing things through the complaint route. We've had quite a lot of discussions around engagement, tenant engagement. I think everyone we've spoken to agreed this is an important issue. It was a big focus of the white paper, but getting the terminology right is going to be crucial, because engagement is a little bit of a jargony term. It means different things to different people. A lot of interest in how we go about defining that in a kind of clear way that is obvious to everybody that participates in the surveys. I've already touched upon the issue around attributing responsibility in terms of neighbourhood contributions and antisocial behaviour. That's something that's come up a lot in our engagement with providers, and we're going to need to think about it quite carefully in the consultation to make sure that it's clear as far as possible what the contribution of different organisations is. A general point about the importance of having precise perception survey questions, particularly on some of those areas that can be very broad, like health and safety, and where it may not necessarily be obvious whether you're talking about the health and safety of the property or the health and safety of the neighbourhood. Is it about crime? Is it about antisocial behaviour? Or is it about the physical safety of the building that you live in, or both? And finally, a lot of particularly technical discussions around the health and safety measures, how we go about defining and capturing the legislative responsibilities that landlords have in that space, and how they should be reported when we come to actually collecting the TSM data on that area. So a lot of detailed technical points that we're going to try and capture in our consultation. The consultation is coming shortly, and as well as the consultation document itself, which will include the standard and a lot of the key questions on the measures that we're proposing, we'll be putting out the draft technical requirements that we would expect providers to follow subject to the consultation. So that will include drafts of the detailed TSMs, the questions, the guidance that you would need to go to help compile and report those measures, a draft of the survey methodology that we'll be looking for providers to follow. We'll also be producing a draft regulatory impact assessment, which sets out the rationale for the proposed intervention, some of the alternative options that we've considered, and has a go at attempting to cost the implications for providers. We're also looking at publishing a draft equalities impact assessment. This is an area with clear equalities implications, given what we know about the different experiences that different groups of tenants have about their landlords, and particularly the difference in their reported satisfaction with their landlords. So we're going to be producing a detailed assessment of the potential implications of our proposals for our equalities objectives. And we're also going to be producing a plain English summary document, recognizing that some of the content of the rest of the package is likely to be quite detailed and technical. And we're also going to be producing an easy read version of it. So a fairly substantial package of consultation material, which will be coming your way shortly. Alongside that, we're going to be contacting providers directly to draw their attention to this and make sure that both landlords and tenants and other stakeholders are aware this is going on. As part of that, we're going to be asking landlords to make sure that the publication of the consultation is communicated to their tenants, and where necessary to help them and support them to respond to it. And we're going to be having a wider program of stakeholder engagement, including speaking events, to explain what it is we're proposing and encourage people to respond to the consultation. So all of this is coming very shortly. So we will be publishing the consultation package in December, ideally with a bit of clear blue water before people start disappearing before Christmas. And we'll then be running the consultation for 3 months into spring next year. Following that, we will analyse the responses we get to the consultation, and consider how we take that into account in producing our final set of propositions for this. Subject to how all of that goes, we'll be looking to publish our final decision statement alongside the final version of the standard, the TSMs, and all of the guidance in probably late summer next year, which would then give both ourselves and landlords the remainder of that financial year to put the preparations in place before the standard comes into effect from the 1st of April 2023. I think we'd be looking to run this on an annual data collection cycle. So the first year's worth of data would apply to the year going from April 23 to March 24. And we then expect the first submission and publication of the data in summer of 24. And then we'll proceed to analyse it, begin to use it in our regulation and publish it from the autumn of 24. So as you can see, it's quite a long lead in time as a result of the need to do a statutory consultation, but also the need for ourselves and the sector to put the necessary preparations in place. So that's one of the reasons why we are moving on the TSMs earlier than much of the rest of our implementation of the consumer regulation, and why the consultation will be coming out next month. So I'll pause for breath at that point, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Rob. I think that's teed us all up contextual-wise nicely for your documents that are going to be coming out in a few weeks. I think it should give attendees some kind of comfort that a substantial amount of work has already been put in to get you to the position that we're actually in with this. Notwithstanding, it's subject to, if you like, even more consultation in terms of the formal consultation. So yeah, clearly just so much work has already been put into this. And I've certainly said to you previously, I think, that the principles that you adopted, that you had a slide on there, for somebody like me that's worked in the field of social housing metrics for such a long time, I think they are the kind of things that the kind of principles that are going to ensure that you've probably got as good a metrics as you can. And of course, it is just a massively contentious subject. So anyway, enough from me. Let's crack on with some questions. As I said before, just to remind you that a recording of this will be available on our website shortly afterwards, along with Rob's slides. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to post questions to Rob. Rachel's been busy. Her first question is, could we have a link to the document? I think the document she's referring to there, Rob, was the document that the RSH published just last week.
Yeah, that's no problem. That's on our website. I'm happy to send you a link after this, Stephen, if you want to circulate it to the
we will. Yeah, we'll get that sorted. So no problem. Yeah, so yeah, definitely worth you having a look at, Rachel, because it just puts all of the RSH's efforts over the past 12 months in context and gives us an idea of the general trajectory. So I would definitely recommend that for everyone. Rachel's also saying, how will the RSH collect the data from smaller providers? Is it likely to be via NROSH? And at present, there's a differential approach between larger and smaller providers. Will it be standardized to ensure that the RSH can get the whole picture? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all of this will be contingent on the outcome of the consultation exercise. We will be including some propositions in the consultation about how we would expect small providers to introduce this. So we're proposing to follow our general set of principles, so we're going to be proportionate in our implementation of this. The standard will apply to everybody in the same way that the rest of our standards do. So the intention is that, subject to the consultation, the new TSM standard would apply to everybody, local authorities and PRPs, both large and small, but that we would implement it in a proportionate way, in the same way that we currently do our economic standards vis-a-vis small providers. So we'll be setting out some more detailed propositions in the consultation, which will cover things like the frequency of surveys for small providers, the standard of statistical accuracy, the submission requirements, how we might go about regulating this for small providers, which will differ a bit from the expectations for large providers. I can't go into too much detail now in advance of the consultation, but it is an area that we'll be specifically drawing out in there and asking for views on, and then we will decide our final approach to how we go about regulating this for smalls and precisely what the requirements will be in terms of data collection, submission, publication, and so on, in the light of the consultation responses. But it's an area we're particularly thinking about, and there will be a dedicated section on it in the consultation.
Yeah.
More generally, in terms of the data collection, it's a bit early to say, but we would envisage this ultimately being a standard data submission to the regulator, in the same way as the regular returns that we collect at the moment, like the SDR, and for large providers the FFR and the FVA and so on and so forth. So through NROSH Plus.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. So yeah, I mean, the whole point is that proportionate approach that you take to smaller providers will be carried on through as far as this is concerned. But I'm guessing, and just back me back on this, because if I'm getting too previous here, but I'd be surprised if you end up suggesting that smaller providers might not do the full suite of metrics.
Wait for the consultation, Steve.
Okay.
We're going to set a detailed proposition. So there's a dedicated section in there on small providers. Yeah. And our start of the 10 proposition is that it will be a proportionate approach. It will differ a bit from the expectation for larger organisations, potentially in a number of dimensions. But exactly where we land up on this, say it is completely open consultation exercise. We recognise that this is an area that a lot of people are going to have an interest in, the final approach will depend on the responses that we get back in the consultation. But the general principle that we're going to take a proportionate approach to smaller landlords is at the heart of our thinking on this.
Brilliant. That will give people quite a bit of comfort, I think. Fantastic. Another question that Rachel's asking, which I think is more for us at Acuity, is about the NatFed looking to establish a working group to promote, together with Tenant Charter. And I think she's probably given us a bit of a nudge that we should be doing something in conjunction with the NatFed on that. Point taken, Rachel. I'll look into that and I'll see what we can come up with. Watch this space. Helen Green saying, is there likely to be a requirement for organisations to have their reporting systems externally validated?
We are, again, we're going to set out some thinking on this kind of issue in the consultation. So I don't want to kind of preempt too much of the detail, but the intention is that the standard subject to consultation will have requirements in it on data accuracy, timeliness, validity, and so on. As a kind of belt and braces, supporting the existing requirements in the governance standard. So we would expect providers to be able to assure themselves of the quality of the data. And going back to the point I made about being able to audit it, we want to make sure there is a trail that is traceable back, so that, if needs be, if there are any concerns about the quality of the data, we at the regulator could go back and look at that as part of our regulation of the provider. So we will want assurance that the processes that have been followed are robust, that they follow the approach that we set out in the guidance, and we can go back and kind of recreate that if we've got any concerns about the approach that's been followed or kind of the quality of the data that's coming out of it.
Brilliant, thanks. And just picking up on the timeliness issue there, was there consideration made of perhaps sort of, if you like, because at the moment, say with the VFM metrics, they're reported within the accounts, and obviously there's quite a lag in terms of the timeliness of the data there. Is the thinking that if this is part of a regulatory return outside of that you can actually get the data in quicker and possibly even in year? Is there any thinking about collecting it even more regularly than annually, for instance?
Yeah. It's something that's been suggested to us, and we've given it a bit of. We've got a balance to strike in here in terms of timeliness and the kind of the burden on providers. So one issue is that in terms of frequency, there is obviously a burden on providers, and some organisations are in better position to be able to get information in very regularly rather than others. So we need something that is comparable across the board. So we need to have a standard date somewhere that applies to everybody, because one of the main drivers of this is variability. So having data that in general applies to the same point in time is an important part of that. So I think we need to have a bit of standardization in there. So yeah, we've got a balancing act on that, and it's something that we're thinking about. But yeah, in general, I think that's probably somewhere we will end up landing up in terms of a standardized figure rather than having people submitting data to us on a kind of rolling different basis.
But if it is annual and if you want it timely, would I be right in thinking it's not going to, because I think this is also what Rachel's kind of suggesting, that it will probably be taken outside of the accounting.
Yeah, we need to think through exactly where this comes in. Yeah, and at the moment we're primarily focusing on what the metrics should be and how they should be collected. We'll be doing more thought in due course, I think, once we've nailed that question in terms of exactly how they're reported and how we collect them, because as you've seen from the timetable, some of that is still a couple of years down the line. A question that we're going to need to think about in that is the accessibility to tenants point, because that's the heart of the proposition. These are meant for tenants, they're meant to be transparent. So, is the audited accounts necessarily the best place for that, discourse? So, we need to give some thought to what is the best way, both for us and for providers, to get the information out there and what the most appropriate route for that should be. That's not something that we're going to settle right now. But there are clear differences between the VFM metrics and the potential audience for them and the TSM. So it may not be that we end up setting exactly the same requirements as we currently do on the VFM metrics.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, because obviously, like you said, early doors as well, a major thrust of this is transparency for tenants and in fact transparency for stakeholders in general. Now, there's the sector, and some of the attendees might lynch me for saying this, but the sector's not been brilliant at reporting to tenants, and it is very patchy. You've got some organisations which are brilliant, and obviously there's going to be the expectation that landlords report to their tenants. In terms of you casting around for other ideas, you mentioned checking out what the Scots do. And of course, the regulator provides a benchmarking tool for tenants to facilitate transparency. Has your thinking advanced anywhere on yourselves creating such a tool for tenants?
It's one of the potential options, and we're not settled on this yet, Steve, to be honest. As I said, for the time being, we're largely focused on getting the metrics and the kind of the collection methodology right. We will be doing a lot more work on the publication submission reporting side of it subsequently, and you will be doing a lot more engagement with the sector on the design of that afterwards, but at the moment, a little bit early to say.
Right, okay. Well, that's certainly my questions. We've got no other questions lurking there. You sometimes get this with the regulator. People get very shy. I don't know if sometimes people think you might be marking them or whatever. But so I think that will do us for now, Rob. Like I said before, thanks so much for that in terms of teeing us up for your consultation. We would, I think, once people have had a chance to get to grips, because as you pointed out, these are going to be quite technical details that I am sure people are going to forensically go over the detail of the definitions as well as the various collection methodologies and implications. And they'll be doing that over the festive period, I am sure. So it would be great to extend an invitation to you again, perhaps in the new year before the consultation is out, for us to, I don't know, put the towels on our heads and have a bit of a session with you about the detail. So we'll look to try and organise something like that if we can in the new year.
Okay, yes, yeah, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, okie dokes. Right, well, thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone, for attending. And do check out the website for the remaining webinars in this series. And yeah, thanks for attending. Cheers, everyone.
Fantastic. Cheers. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.